Did you know that Green Goblin wasn't the only comic book villain that appeared in the original 2002 Spider-Man movie? We all remember William Dafoe's iconic performance as the movie's main villain. He perfectly performed a truly mentally unhinged Norman Osborn. He's a huge part as to why the movie was so good. But a lot of people don't know that the Green Goblin wasn't the only villain from Spider-Man comics that was adapted in the film. The second minor villain that appeared was that guy. He is Dr. Mendel Stromm, an obscure enemy from Spider-Man comics that actually appeared very early on in The Amazing Spider-Man number 37 in June 1966 during the original Stan Lee and Steve Ditko run. And in Marvel Comics, he was a scientist that worked at Oscorp and whose research on a strength-enhancing chemical would later lead into the formula that would turn Norman Osborn into the Green Goblin. And Osborn would later frame Stromm for embezzling company funds, with him later reporting Stromm to the police. He would be sent to jail, serving a prison sentence for years, with Dr. Stromm later escaping prison and taking revenge on Norman Osborn with his robotic inventions. And Dr. Stromm would later continue to appear in different comics throughout the years with a more cybernetic appearance, sometimes under the names Robot Master and Gaunt. During 2002 Spider-Man, Dr. Mendel Stromm, similarly to the comics, also appeared as a scientist working for Oscorp alongside Norman Osborn, researching chemicals that would enhance people's strength and stamina, even though he seemed doubtful about the stability of the project, with him later being killed after Norman Osborn tested the chemical serum on himself, causing him to lose his mind and savagely murder Dr. Stromm. And honestly, this is pretty cool. I find it cool that Sam Raimi and the creatives behind the original Spider-Man movie cared so much about being respectful and making a careful translation of the comics to the big screen that they even adapted such a minor character like Dr. Stromm from Spider-Man's earliest stories, all because he was crucial in the Green Goblin and the Goblin formula's origin. Dr. Stromm is only one example of a classic comic book villain from Spider-Man's stories who was actually adapted onto his movies, but many people might have not realized that they were costumed villains in the source material. So today, I wanted to go over his many live-action films and point out all the obscure and minor characters who were adaptations of comic book characters hidden in plain sight. This video is actually a sequel to another video I made about secret villains hidden in Batman movies, which performed pretty well, and I'm honestly really glad that you guys enjoyed it. I really appreciate all the feedback and the engagement that this channel has been receiving, and I just want to sincerely thank you guys so much, especially because this gives me an excuse to rewatch some great movies.
Norman?
Another villain who we almost got to see during 2002 Spider-Man was Venom. Well, kind of. Some people might remember a scene during the film set in the Daily Bugle where J. Jonah Jameson is discussing when they are going to get pictures of Spider-Man, and Robbie Robertson mentions having a photographer named Eddie already working on it.
Problem is, we don't have a decent picture. Eddie's been on it for weeks. We can barely get a glimpse of him.
Oh, what is he, shy?
This unseen Eddie was actually meant to be none other than Eddie Brock, who was allegedly meant to appear in a deleted scene where Eddie would confront Peter Parker in the Daily Bugle. He was meant to be played by actor R.C. Everbeck, who actually shared a behind-the-scenes photo with him and J.K. Simmons a few years back. In the end, even though Eddie Brock didn't appear in the original Spider-Man, we did end up seeing Eddie Brock and his turn into Venom in Spider-Man 3, where he was portrayed by Topher Grace, a bare-bones adaptation that felt rushed and greatly underdeveloped, mostly because Venom's inclusion was forced into the movie by Sony's request, despite Sam Raimi not wanting to do it. So considering this, it's interesting to speculate how Spider-Man 3 could have been if we had previously seen Eddie Brock during Spider-Man 1 and 2. Maybe if the character had more build-up and prior development, his transformation into a villain could have been more impactful than being introduced to the character and seeing his villain turn all in the same movie, alongside two other undercooked villain plots. But I guess we'll never know what could have been if they had included that deleted scene into the movie. Speaking of deleted scenes, there's another Spider-Man villain who was almost included into a movie, but his only scene was cut in post-production. The thing is, it didn't happen in a Spider-Man movie. This happened in a Blade movie, because in the original Blade film from 1998, they had actually filmed a scene setting up Morbius, the character of all time, as the main villain of a potential Blade 2.
As long as there's a war going on, I still have a job to do.
Oh yeah? Then you're back on the clock.
It was later revealed during an audio commentary by the film's writer David S. Goyer that Morbius was actually planned to be used by the first movie's director, Stephen Norrington, had he directed the sequel. However, Blade 2 ended up being directed by Guillermo del Toro after Norrington rejected the studio's offer to direct the sequel and dropped out of the project. And once del Toro joined the film, he would drop Morbius as the villain and would create the Reapers instead. But it would have been interesting to see Morbius as its main villain, especially since in the comics, he is mostly portrayed as a sympathetic anti-hero more than anything else. And getting back to the Raimi films, one cool fact about the franchise is that there was a CG animated series that aired on MTV back in 2003 called Spider-Man: The New Animated Series, that was actually meant to loosely tie into the Raimi films, and it adapted a number of comic book villains like Silver Sable, Electro, the Lizard, Kraven the Hunter, but the most interesting villain that appeared, in my opinion, was Kingpin, mainly because he was voiced by the great Michael Clarke Duncan, the same actor who played Kingpin in the 2003 Ben Affleck Daredevil movie. And even though the new animated series isn't really set in the same continuity as the Raimi trilogy, it's still fun to think about the possibility of those movies and the 2003 Daredevil film being set in the same universe. And another fun fact is that this wrestler that appeared in Spider-Man is actually identified as Jack Murdock, Daredevil's father, in the novelization of Spider-Man 1, although he's played by a completely different actor than the Jack Murdock in the Daredevil movie, but still. Moving on to the classic Spider-Man 2, a minor character who a lot of people might have not paid much attention to was John Jameson, Mary Jane's fiance, and J. Jonah Jameson's astronaut son, who in the comics actually had a superpowered persona named Colonel Jupiter, who you might remember from Spectacular Spider-Man. Later in the 1970s, John Jameson also transformed into Man-Wolf after traveling to the moon on a mission and finding a mystical ruby named the Godstone, which allowed him to transform. And Jameson would even be granted cosmic powers when he adopted the mantle of the Star God. So yeah, this normal, unassuming guy actually has 3 different identities in the comics. Another villain that had a minor role in Spider-Man 2 was Dr. Curt Connors, also known as the Lizard, one of Spider-Man's earliest villains from the comics. Since in the movie, Peter Parker started attending college, they found it a perfect opportunity to introduce Curt Connors as his professor, and they were actually plans to eventually turn the character into his Lizard persona. Had the Raimi Spider-Man franchise continued after the mixed reception of Spider-Man 3, and later on, after Sam Raimi stepped down from producing Spider-Man 4, and Sony decided to move ahead with a reboot of the franchise, they decided to go with the Lizard as their first villain for their new reboot film. Now, near the end of Spider-Man 2, when Mary Jane is about to get married, only to leave, running away to meet with Peter, we can briefly see a guy on the street. This guy, who is actually meant to be the Punisher, who, as many of you probably know, debuted as a villain in Spider-Man comics originally. While filming Spider-Man 2, they had tried to get Thomas Jane, the actor that portrayed Punisher in the 2004 movie, to make a brief cameo during this scene, but they couldn't do it due to contractual issues, so they reportedly used Thomas Jane's stunt double instead. And I just find it fun to think about how we almost could have gotten an interconnected shared universe between the early 2000s Marvel films. I mean, besides this Punisher scene, Michael Clarke Duncan's Kingpin appearing in the new animated series, and Morbius almost appearing in Blade, Hugh Jackman was also almost included in a brief cameo scene during the 2002 film. with Jackman even traveling to New York to shoot the scene, but they couldn't do it because they couldn't acquire Wolverine's X-Men suit, so they scrapped this idea. But just imagine if we would have seen the MCU in the early 2000s rather than 2008.
I am completely in the wrong movie. I am so sorry.
Moving on to Spider-Man 3, during a brief scene in the movie where we can see Harry Osborn's Goblin gear, we can see 3 Goblin masks, with one of them having a gold coloration, and a lot of fans speculate that it's meant to be the Hobgoblin's mask and a possible setup for the character had the Raimi franchise continued. We don't have any official comments or plans for Hobgoblin from Sam Raimi, if he had any. But it's still cool to think about the possibility of Hobgoblin eventually being adapted into a movie, which I certainly hope so. Green Goblin has already appeared in 3 live-action Spider-Man movies, so it's possible that the next time they use a Goblin villain, they go with Hobgoblin instead. Bruce Campbell is a frequent collaborator of Sam Raimi. They've worked on multiple movies together throughout the years, and he actually had brief cameo appearances in all 3 Spider-Man movies, playing different small roles every time.
What's your name, kid?
The Human Spider.
The Human Spider, that's it? That's the best you got?
Yeah.
Oh, that sucks.
And there's a popular rumor that's been circulating online for years now that had the series continued, and during Spider-Man 4, Sam Raimi would have had Bruce Campbell come back for another cameo scene once again, but this time, he would be playing Mysterio. It would have been during a scene where Spider-Man would quickly fight and apprehend Mysterio as a part of a larger montage scene where Spidey would have fought some of his smaller villains that Raimi felt like he never would have used as the main antagonist of a movie. So in this montage scene, we would have seen cameos from the Shocker, Rhino, the Prowler, and Stiltman, alongside Mysterio, and it's rumored that he was going to be played by Bruce Campbell because there's a storyboard for the film that kinda resembles him. However, this has been debunked by Campbell himself in an interview with Game Informer a few years back.
Were you going to be Mysterio if another Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie happened?
If somebody's wet dream came true, no, that's all fan shit.
How would your approach differ from Jake Gyllenhaal?
In every way imaginable.
So maybe it was never intended to play Mysterio, or maybe production on Spider-Man 4 never got far enough for Sony to actually offer him the role. But even though Bruce Campbell never got to do this, to have him play Mysterio would have been really fun. Although I did enjoy Jake Gyllenhaal's take on the character years later in Far From Home. Speaking of Sam Raimi's planned Spider-Man 4, after the third movie's mixed reception, largely due to Sony's interference and forcing the director to include Venom, Raimi wanted to rectify things for the fans, who felt disappointed by the last movie, and deliver a story that was true to his vision. So he was planning on using the Vulture as the film's main villain, and he actually already had planned to use Vulture in Spider-Man 3 alongside Sandman, but he was talked out of it by the studio because Sony felt like Vulture wasn't a popular enough villain for fans to get excited about, so they insisted on Venom's inclusion instead. For the potential 4th film, however, Raimi had envisioned presenting Vulture as Spider-Man's most formidable enemy up to that point, showing him as the most violent, powerful, and highly competent adversary he had ever faced, with the character buying and taking control over the Daily Bugle, and Peter Parker getting romantically involved with Felicia Hardy, who in the film would have been portrayed as the Vulture's daughter. And it's rumored she either would have adopted the identity of Black Cat or the Vultress. Working alongside her father to defeat Spider-Man, they were planning on casting Anne Hathaway as Felicia Hardy and John Malkovich as the Vulture. There was plenty of work done for the film before its cancellation, and there's been a number of production designs and concepts that have been uploaded onto the internet, such as these storyboard animatics done by artist Jeffrey Henderson that show a battle between the Vulture and Spider-Man, which honestly looks pretty sick, and I kinda wish we could have gotten to see the Raimi films continue rather than getting the rebooted Amazing Spider-Man movies that Sony made after this, but that's exactly what we got. As we all know, the Lizard was the main villain of The Amazing Spider-Man. After the feeling that Spider-Man 3 failed because it had too many villains and storylines, they wanted to streamline the next movie and focus on a singular villain, which ended up being Curt Connors. But there were actually reports about another minor villain almost being adapted in the reboot. Back in 2010, a lot of news outlets reported that Sony announced a character called Van Adder was going to be the main villain of the 2012 reboot. Van Adder seemed to be a misspelling of Nels Van Adder, who in the comics was revealed in a retcon as being the first Goblin known as the Proto Goblin, since Van Adder was the assistant of Dr. Mendel Stromm, and he was used as the first test subject for an early version of the Goblin formula, which after entering his system transformed him into a mutated red monster. However, the Proto Goblin seemed to have been considered as a possible villain only in early drafts of the screenplay, and the character was reworked into Rajit Ratha, the colleague of Curt Connors. Now, even though there was a conscious attempt to somewhat streamline The Amazing Spider-Man and keep it simple, they pretty much threw that out the window for the sequel, because The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is absolutely stuffed with characters, and this is because Sony had big plans to create a shared cinematic universe all centered around Spider-Man and Spider-Man adjacent characters. And due to this, Amazing Spider-Man 2 was basically used as a vehicle to set up a number of different potential spin-offs. So they included a lot of characters that have secret identities in the comics. One such character is Felicia Hardy. After almost appearing in Spider-Man 4, she finally was adapted in this movie, where she was played by Felicity Jones. Had the film series continued, we would have seen her use the Black Cat identity, and there were actually plans to use the character for a spin-off film with her and Silver Sable co-starring. Another minor villain that was adapted was Allistair Smythe, who was depicted as an employee at Oscorp and ordered Max Dillon to check on an electrical fault, which resulted in him transforming into Electro. Smythe was played by BJ Novak, you know, from The Office.
My favorite branch. How's everybody doing?
In the comics, Allistair Smythe is the son of Spencer Smythe, a scientist that developed killer robots specifically designed to hunt down Spider-Man called the Spider Slayers. And after Spencer died, his son Allistair continued his mission to hunt down Spider-Man. He even has a superpowered form as an ultimate Spider Slayer, and most fans probably remember him from the 90s animated series. It's likely that not that many people paid attention to the scientist who was making experiments on Electro when he was being held prisoner by Oscorp in the Ravencroft Institute for the Criminally Insane. But that scientist was actually a minor character from Spider-Man comics called Dr. Ashley Kafka, who in the source material is a psychiatrist that also works in the Ravencroft Institute, but she's actually a woman instead of a man. The character was gender bent for the movie. Dr. Kafka also isn't really a villain originally, she's more of a minor supporting character. But in 2022, way after the movie was released, she did become a villain in the comics called the Queen Goblin. When thinking about villains in the Amazing Spider-Man series, besides the more well-known ones like the Lizard, Electro, Green Goblin, and Rhino, a lot of people might also think about the mysterious guy that briefly appeared in the endings of both films, especially since he seemed to have bigger ties to Spider-Man's past, given that he approached the villains himself and even appeared in a scene that was setting up the Secret Six. This mysterious man is actually named Gustav Fierce, also known as the Gentleman. And he actually didn't originate from the comics. He was a character created in a series of Spider-Man novels written by Adam Troy Castro, first appearing in the book Spider-Man: The Gathering of the Secret Six. And in the books, Gustav is described as a powerful mastermind, and his brother, Carl Fierce, was an assassin that worked on the Red Skull, and he actually murdered Peter Parker's parents. So in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, it's kind of implied that the man that attempted to kill Richard and Mary Parker in the airplane scene is actually Carl Fierce. The gentleman is also featured in a scene from The Amazing Spider-Man 2 that sets up the appearance of the Sinister Six, where he speaks to Harry Osborn about the formation of a group, and in Oscorp Tower, they show the characteristic items of multiple different Spider-Man enemies, specifically Doc Ock's tentacles, Rhino's horn, Vulture's wings, Kraven the Hunter's insignia, and hints to either Chameleon or Mysterio with this unidentified mask. Norman Osborn's frozen head was also briefly shown, which suggests that he might have returned, possibly appeared as the Green Goblin himself. And in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, we can also see Easter eggs for Venom and Morbius in a computer screen. As mentioned previously, all of these inclusions were because of Sony's intentions to start a shared cinematic universe with Spider-Man-centered characters, something they did end up doing even after the Amazing Spider-Man series had ended. But originally, we were going to get a Secret Six film directed by Drew Goddard, which was described by him as being similar in spirit to The Dirty Dozen. But as we all know, Sony would abandon the Amazing Spider-Man universe to collaborate with Disney and bring Peter Parker to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, starting in Captain America Civil War. And we can also point out a number of minor characters that were supervillains adapted from the comics. We all remember Michael Keaton's performance as Vulture in Spider-Man Homecoming. That reveal scene, when they showed that he's the father of Liz Allen, was just insane, and he was genuinely a great villain in my opinion. But we should also remember his team, comprised of his employees that lost their jobs when Vulture's company went out of business, and they later helped him in taking down Spider-Man. One minor villain that appeared as a part of that team was the Shocker, where we got to see two versions of him. The original Herman Schultz incarnation of the character, and also Jackson Bryce, or Montana, who in the comics is actually a part of the Enforcers. But we have seen him take up the mantle of Shocker before in Spectacular Spider-Man. Tinkerer is another minor villain from Spider-Man comics that was adapted as a member of Vulture's team, with him being shown creating technology out of the Chitauri alien technology that was left on Earth following the first Avengers movie. And another minor villain that was a part of Vulture's team was Randy Vale, who in the comics is known as Darter, a young college student that discovered Carrion, the clone of Miles Warren, and he was convinced to attack Spider-Man together, with Randy getting an advanced suit that allowed him to glide and shoot lasers. A lot of you might remember that Donald Glover, Childish Gambino himself, also had a minor role in Spider-Man Homecoming, portraying Aaron Davis, the ultimate version of the Prowler, and he's also known for being the uncle of Miles Morales. And what's actually cool is that we already have official confirmation that Miles does exist within the MCU, because there was a deleted post-credits scene from the movie that shows Aaron Davis webbed to a car because of Spider-Man and calling his nephew to let him know that he won't make it to an event as he had promised.
Yeah, sorry Miles, I'm not gonna make it. Yeah, I'm just stuck.
And I find this especially cool because Miles Morales' creator, Brian Michael Bendis, has even stated in the past that the entire idea to create a black Spider-Man came from Donald Glover's campaign and insistence to be casted as the first African-American Spider-Man in the then upcoming Spider-Man reboot, with him even using the costume. So I just think it's nice to see this cycle of inspiration come full circle, with Donald Glover not only being casted in a Spider-Man film, but also forever tying him to Miles Morales' introduction into live-action films, even though he hasn't physically appeared in an MCU movie, but we all know that it's only a matter of time. And Miles does star in the Spiderverse series, where we also got to see Donald Glover reprise the role of Prowler, but this time in full costume, although he was captured by the Spider Society. The last villain that appeared in Homecoming we haven't talked about yet is Mac Gargan, also known as Scorpion, where he was shown as a dangerous gangster and actually gets set up to return in order to take revenge on Spider-Man after he was arrested because of him, following a failed deal between him and the Vulture that was interrupted by Spider-Man. But as of this day, after years of this movie coming out, we still haven't seen the full live-action cinematic debut of Scorpion. but hopefully we get to see him in the new movies post No Way Home, and maybe they'll tie his storyline with the small piece of the symbiote that was left on the MCU's main Earth. That way we could get to see Mac Gargan become both Scorpion and Venom eventually. It would be insanely cool. Following Homecoming, we got to see Far From Home, which mainly focused on Spider-Man working alongside at first and later fighting against Mysterio. But when the movie came out, a lot of fans also noticed that the elementals that appeared in the film were pretty clearly based after the comic book villains Cyclone, Sandman, Molten Man, and Hydro Man. However, there was also another minor character that appeared in Far From Home, who was also an adaptation of a minor Spider-Man villain, and that's her. She's meant to be Janice Lincoln, who in the comics uses the identity of Lady Beetle, or just the Beetle. She worked for Baron Zemo and is also the daughter of Tombstone, another awesome Spider-Man villain. In Far From Home, she appears as a member of Mysterio's team and an ex-employee of Stark Industries. And technically, the Chameleon also had a minor role in Far From Home, since the bus driver of Peter Parker's class and his vacation is credited in the movie as Dmitri, and fans speculate that he's actually Dmitri Smerdyakov, which is the Chameleon's real identity, mostly because in Far From Home, he was depicted as being an agent secretly working for Nick Fury, so considering he was being covert, it would kinda make sense for him to be Chameleon. Now, if we're talking about comic book villains that are quote-unquote hidden in plain sight, or that have appeared in Spider-Man movies but their villain storylines haven't been addressed yet, then I already know that a lot of you have already been thinking about Ned Leeds, Peter Parker's best friend in the MCU series of films that also takes some inspiration from the Ultimate Universe character Genki. And that's because if you're familiar with the comics, you know that Ned Leeds has been one of the characters that's used the mantle of the Hobgoblin, even though it was revealed that he was brainwashed into acting as the Hobgoblin and wasn't the actual real identity of the villain. Even though it was revealed that he was brainwashed into acting as the Hobgoblin and wasn't the actual real identity of the villain, he's still heavily associated with the character. And it's still pretty reasonable to think that Marvel will eventually transform the MCU Ned Leeds into Hobgoblin as well. And given that the character was shown to be able to use magic, something that Hobgoblin has also been shown to do in the comics, is another thing that supports the idea that we will most likely eventually get to see Ned Leeds turn into a villain and fight against his former best friend, which is something that I'd personally love to see if I'm being honest. But there you go, those were all the minor characters from Spider-Man movies that were actually low-key adaptations of comic book villains. Though of course, it's also possible that I missed something. So let me know in the comments what other details from Spider-Man movies you've noticed while watching them. And also, what villain would you like to see as the main antagonist of a Spider-Man movie that they haven't used before? Personally, as I mentioned earlier, I would love to see Mac Gargan return as Scorpion, but I'd also love to see Ned Leeds become Hobgoblin. Or maybe they could do a more street-level story with Kingpin fighting against Spider-Man and Daredevil. There's a lot of possibilities. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and as always, thank you so much for watching.